The clink of forks faded, and conversations paused as a heavy silence fell across the dining room. My mother stood at the head of the table, her wine glass raised high. 14 people, including family, friends, and colleagues, turned to listen as she flashed that sharp, performative smile she always saved for a crowd. "I am so blessed to have 2 daughters," she began. "One is a prestigious lawyer arguing important cases in Washington, while the other, well, she just won Employee of the Month at a grocery store." Laughter rippled through the room. There were polite chuckles and knowing glances exchanged between the guests. I was still standing behind the serving table, having not even found a chance to sit down yet. My hand tightened around the serving spoon, and I could feel my face burning with heat. My sister Callie smiled modestly and raised her glass in acknowledgement, as if she had earned the compliment through actual achievement, rather than just being the favorite. I forced my face into a neutral expression and tried to breathe normally, but inside, something finally cracked. This was not the first time my mother had humiliated me publicly, and it certainly was not the 10th. But something about this specific moment felt different. Standing there in front of 14 witnesses while my mother reduced my entire existence to a punchline broke something deep within me. In that space, something new started to grow. My name is Naomi Cruz, and this is how everything changed. I sat down anyway, taking my assigned seat at the far end of the table, as far from my mother and Callie as possible. My face was still hot, but I smiled and passed the potatoes, laughing at the appropriate moments, because that is what I had always done. I had always been the dreamer in a family that worshipped titles and high salaries. Callie had made partner at a corporate law firm by age 30 with a corner office and a 6-figure salary, while I wrote poems that nobody read and sold used books for $16 an hour. Whenever my mother's friends asked what I did for work, she would simply say that Naomi was still finding herself. She made it sound like I was lost or incomplete, like a project that had not quite worked out. Callie was the success story and the proof of good parenting, while I was merely a disappointing footnote. But that night, as I sat at the table while everyone pretended I had not just been mocked, something shifted. I was not sad anymore. I was angry, and I was beginning to learn that anger can bring a very sharp focus. After dinner, I tried to help in the kitchen because I needed to do something with my hands to keep busy. My aunt cornered me while I was washing wine glasses, telling me that my mother just worried about me and didn't want me to waste my potential. I looked up and asked her what potential she meant, and she sighed, mentioning a real career and stability. She told me my mother just wanted me to be happy, but when I told her I was happy, she asked if I really was. The question felt judgmental and pitying, as if I were a broken project everyone was too polite to throw away. Inside, I felt like I was 13 again, standing in the guidance counselor's office while my mother explained that I was creative but unfocused, which was her code for being a disappointment. My aunt patted my shoulder and changed the subject, but the damage was done. Later, Callie found me in the hallway and told me not to take our mother's comments personally. I asked her how else I should take it, and she just claimed that our mother brags in a weird way but loves me. Callie then pulled out her wallet and handed me a check for $300 for rent or whatever I needed. I looked at the check and her pitying expression. It felt like I was a charity case, as if a bit of money could fix a lifetime of being second best. I told her I didn't need her money, but she insisted I shouldn't be proud. I took the check, walked to the bathroom, and ripped it into tiny pieces before flushing it down her perfect guest toilet. I watched the pieces swirl away, washed my hands, and rejoined the party with a smile on my face. Later that night, Callie left her iPad charging on the kitchen counter while I was putting away leftovers. A notification popped up from a group message called Cruz Family Real Talk. I froze because I was in a family group chat, but it wasn't this one. This was a secret chat. I picked up the iPad and my stomach dropped as I saw photos from the dinner and inside jokes I wasn't part of. I scrolled up and found months of messages. My name appeared when a cousin asked if I was coming to Christmas, and my mother replied that I was probably still in my little artist phase, followed by a laugh. I took a screenshot, sent it to myself, and put the iPad back exactly where I found it. A week later, my mother was being honored at her women's club for community leadership. She hadn't invited me directly, but I showed up anyway, dressed in a navy dress and the pearls my grandmother had left me. I was hoping for some kind of acknowledgement. The room was packed with people who had known my mother her whole life. She gave a speech about her career and her values. And then she said she was so grateful to have raised a daughter like Callie. She used the singular word, daughter. She looked right past me in the third row and talked only about Callie's achievements and partnership. She didn't mention me once. I excused myself halfway through, walked home in the rain, and cried the entire way. The next day, a woman in her mid-40s came into the bookstore. She was professional yet warm, and we chatted easily while I rang up her purchases. She mentioned she worked for a law firm in D.C., specializing in corporate law. When I told her my sister Callie Cruz worked in that same field at Whitman and Associates, the woman's expression shifted instantly. She asked if Callie had left the firm recently, mentioning she had heard there was a situation. My heart skipped a beat. Callie hadn't said a word about leaving her firm. That night, I sent a casual text asking how work was going. Hours later, she replied with a photo of a beach sunset and a cocktail, claiming she was living her best life, but she offered no details about her job. I checked her LinkedIn. It still listed her as a senior associate, but I noticed it hadn't been updated in 8 months. I decided to dig deeper. I Googled Whitman and Associates and found an article about an internal review regarding billing irregularities. Deep in the comments, someone had mentioned the name C. Cruz. I screenshotted everything. At Sunday brunch, I casually asked my mother if Callie had changed firms. My mother's fork stopped midair. She immediately became defensive, telling me not to be jealous and that I wouldn't understand Callie's complicated world. She insisted Callie was doing better than ever, but her overreaction told me everything I needed to know. She was hiding something. A few weeks later, I was helping my mother clean out my grandmother's storage unit. While she was distracted, I saw a key on her ring labeled Unit 709 Callie. I recognized the facility name. It was only 2 blocks from my apartment. I memorized the unit number and went there late that night. I used Callie's birthday as the combination, and the lock clicked open. Inside were dozens of boxes of legal files and personal correspondence. I found one box labeled Confidential. With shaking hands, I opened it and found a formal letter from a woman named Patricia Hoffman addressed to the firm's Human Resources Department. It was a complaint for billing fraud. Patricia had been Callie's assistant and had witnessed Callie systematically padding billable hours for over 18 months. The firm had settled quietly to avoid a scandal, forcing Callie out while calling it a mutual departure. Callie hadn't been promoted or taken time off for her success. She had been fired for fraud. And my mother knew every single detail. I photographed every document and uploaded them to a secure drive before locking the unit and slipping away into the night. The following weekend, my mother hosted another family brunch to celebrate what she called Callie's new chapter. Everyone was there, extended family and my mother's closest friends. As they gathered, Mom stood up to make yet another toast. She called Callie our legal genius and explained that she was taking some well-deserved time off before her next big opportunity. Everyone applauded while Callie sat there, looking humble and gracious. I sat quietly with my drink, knowing the truth. I knew my mother was lying to everyone in that room, and nobody questioned it because Callie was the golden child, and golden children aren't allowed to fail. My mind flashed back to 2 years ago when I finally got my own tiny studio apartment. My mother had co-signed the lease because I needed the help, but only 3 months in, she called to say she was removing herself as a co-signer for financial reasons. She had already spoken to the landlord, and since my income didn't qualify on its own, I was evicted 30 days later. I spent 6 months couch surfing and even slept in my car twice. When I begged for help, my mother simply said it wasn't her job to fund failure and told me I needed to grow up. Meanwhile, Callie lived rent-free in a brownstone my mother had bought as an investment. My mother's excuse was that Callie's career required it, while I just worked in a bookstore. It was as if my life mattered less. That night, I wrote a poem called The Invisible Daughter. It was about living in a shadow, about being loved only on certain conditions, and about watching one sibling be worshipped while the other is merely tolerated. I posted it to my small blog that usually only had a handful of followers. But something happened. It got shared once, then again, and by the morning, it had thousands of shares. The comments were a flood of people saying they felt the exact same way. One comment, however, made me freeze. Someone asked if the poem was about Callie Cruz. The details were specific enough that people in the legal circle were starting to connect the dots. My inbox exploded. 3 days later, I received a formal legal letter from a firm I didn't recognize, representing Callie. It was a cease and desist order, threatening me with a lawsuit if I didn't remove the defamatory content immediately. I read it twice, then I took a screenshot and posted the threat directly to my blog without a single caption. I let the image speak for itself. The internet reacted instantly. My mother called me, sobbing and screaming, asking how I could do this to my sister. She accused me of being jealous and wanting to ruin Callie's life. I stayed perfectly calm and told her I had only written a poem about my own experience. If Callie looked bad, maybe it was because of her own actions. My mother screamed that I had always been the one to tear her down before I finally hung up. Then I received a message on LinkedIn from the woman I had met in the bookstore. She told me she worked in legal compliance and had seen my post. She confirmed she had access to the whistleblower networks, and that what Callie did was documented. She offered to be a witness if I ever needed one. I finally had an ally. The game was truly on. The momentum shifted from a personal grievance into a public reckoning. A popular podcast focusing on toxic family dynamics reached out to me after seeing my blog post go viral. They wanted me to tell the story of the invisible daughter in my own words. I agreed, although I was careful. I did not name Callie directly because I did not have to. I simply spoke my truth about the psychological toll of being the family scapegoat. I described the pain of being evicted by my own mother while my sister lived in luxury and the sting of being edited out of my mother's public life. I spoke about the shock of discovering that the golden standards I was judged against were actually built on a foundation of professional fraud. The episode was released on a Tuesday, and by Friday it had reached 500,000 downloads. The comment sections on social media became a battlefield of shared experiences. People were not just listening to a story, they were seeing the cracks in the perfect family archetype. However, the real fallout happened when a journalist from a prominent legal publication picked up the scent. They published an investigative piece about the dark side of legal success stories. While they used pseudonyms for legal reasons, the timeline of the billing irregularities at Whitman and Associates and the specific details of the mutual departure aligned perfectly with Callie's career. The legal community is a small world, and anyone paying attention now knew exactly who the article was about. The digital walls began to close in on Callie. Her LinkedIn profile, which had been a monument to her ego, suddenly disappeared. Her Instagram, once filled with aesthetic photos and expensive cocktails, went private. She was no longer the rising star, but a liability in hiding. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, the tension reached a boiling point. My mother sent me a text message. It was not an apology, but a cold and brief command. She said I was still invited to Thanksgiving for the sake of the family and asked me to be civil. I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to decline to spend the day in the quiet comfort of my bookstore life. But then I realized that declining would be another act of disappearing. I was tired of being the one who left the room so they could feel comfortable. I replied, yes, but this year I was not arriving as the quiet daughter who would smile through the insults. I was not just bringing a side dish to the table. I was bringing the truth that they had spent years trying to bury. On the morning of Thanksgiving, the atmosphere at the house was suffocating. The same 14 people were there, including the same colleagues and friends who had laughed at my mother's jokes the year before. The energy was different now as people whispered in corners and cast sidelong glances at Callie, who looked haggard despite her expensive outfit. We sat down to the meal, and for an hour everyone played a desperate game of make-believe, pretending that the podcasts and articles did not exist. Then my mother stood up for her traditional toast. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised her glass. She began to say how grateful she was for her family and how incredibly proud she was of her brilliant daughter. I did not wait for her to finish. I did not even raise my voice. I simply looked her in the eye and interrupted her. I asked her which daughter she meant, the one who systematically defrauded her clients, or the one who survived her. The dining room turned into an icebox. 14 faces froze in mid-air. Callie's face went a ghostly shade of white, and my mother's mouth hung open as her carefully constructed mask finally shattered into 1,000 pieces. The silence in the room was absolute as I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy manila envelope. I slid it across the table toward my mother, and it came to rest right next to her wine glass. I told her that this was the person she had spent years building up while tearing me down. I told her this was the daughter she had praised and chosen over me. I opened the envelope and let the documents spill out across the white tablecloth for everyone to see. There were the evidence of billing fraud, the formal complaints from the assistants, the secret settlement agreements, and the emails proving the entire cover-up. I gestured to myself and told the room that I was the one she had tried to bury for the sake of that lie. I stood up and grabbed my coat while Callie stared at the table in total silence, and my mother looked like she had aged 10 years in a single second. I told them to enjoy their dinner, and I walked out the front door without looking back. The fallout was immediate and devastating for their reputation. My cousin shared the podcast episode in the secret family group chat that I had finally been invited to by other relatives who were tired of the lies. Someone leaked even more information, and other associates from Callie's old firm started coming forward to confirm the story. Callie deleted every trace of herself from social media, and my mother sent a frantic message to the family claiming we were under attack and begging everyone not to respond to the rumors. No ludiet vetelimnia. I received dozens of private messages from family friends, apologizing and saying they had no idea what had been happening behind the scenes. The image of the perfect family had cracked completely and could never be fixed. I eventually wrote a long letter to my mother. I did not send it to start a fight, but just to say the things I could never say to her face. I told her that I did not forgive her and that I probably never would, but I had realized something important. She never actually saw the real me clearly enough to hurt me. She only hated the version of me she had created in her head, the version she labeled as a failure. But that person did not exist. I was whole, talented, and worthy with or without her approval. I closed my notebook and I finally let her go. 1 year later, my small book of poetry hit #1 on an independent digital chart. The final poem was titled, "The Invisible Daughter Speaks." I was invited to read at a literary festival in a small venue filled with people who actually wanted to hear my voice. I walked up to the microphone and introduced myself as Naomi Cruz. I told them I was a poet, a bookseller, and a daughter who had learned that being loved conditionally meant learning to love myself unconditionally. I heard the applause and I finally felt seen. It was not because I had beaten my sister or proven my mother wrong, but because I had finally introduced myself to the world on my own terms. The Beggar daughter became a best-selling voice, and that was more valuable than any approval I had ever chased. I was finally free.